What would you do if the person you loved, the person you helped build from nothing, looked you in the eye at the most important event of his life and told a security guard to remove you from the VIP section like you were a stranger who had wandered in off? What would you do if he whispered something in the ear of a woman dripping in diamond designer fabric and then turned back to a smile so casual it made your stomach and said the word calm, slow, deliberate? I'm sorry, but you're just a guest here. Please enjoy. What would you do if the room went quiet for exactly 2 seconds and then erupted in barely concealed laughter and cutting glances, and you could feel the weight of every pair of eyes at harbor pressing down on you like a stone? I'll tell you, I smiled. Not the warm smile I had been wearing 2 years, him comfortable, to keep his mother pacified, to keep his world from collapsing under the weight of its own No, this was a different kind of smile entirely. The kind that doesn't reach the kind that certain people, the ones who have been in real rooms with real power, recognize instantly. I reached into the small clutch I was, a simple black satin bag, nothing that matched the gowns and the jewels and the chandelier light of the Dorado Maritime Hall, and I pressed my thumb against a surface no larger than 30 seconds later, the harbor light. They didn't know it yet. They were The security guard was still holding his arm out, gesturing toward the general admissions area, like I was supposed to follow a velvet rope to my designated humiliation. Marcus was still smiling, that slow, serpentine smile at Valentina Holt, the heiress whose presence in that room had somehow convinced him that his entire future could be rearranged in a single evening. They had no idea that at that exact moment, 17 vessels were repositioning outside. They had no idea that 43 black SUVs, armored, silent, bearing no commercial plates, were already moving in coordinated formation along the 3 road access points to the Dorado Maritime property. They had no idea who they never had, and that was entirely my name, the one on the event's guest list, the one on the modest rental agreement for my apartment in the Westport district, the one I had given Marcus when we met 2 years and 4 months earlier, was Elena Voss. Elena Voss was an archivist. She worked 3 days a week at the Alderman Foundation, cataloging maritime historical documents, which was actually the most honest part of the fiction, because I do genuinely love those. She drove a used Volvo, the color of old pewter. She wore clothes that were clean and carefully chosen, but never branded. She paid for coffee with cash, tipped generously, and never talked about money, except to say she didn't have much of it. Elena Voss was a very convincing person. She was also completely. My real name is Isadora Valea Montclair Dresner. I am the only surviving heir of the Montclair Dresner maritime dynasty, which my great-great-grandfather founded in 1887 with a single cargo vessel operating between the Portuguese coast and the islands of the Atlantic. What that single vessel became, over 4 generations of obsessive, strategic, and occasionally ruthless expansion, is the largest privately controlled maritime from the planet. Not the largest register, the largest privately controlled fleet, military-grade vessel, deep-water cargo infrastructure, port authority stakes in 11 countries, and a defense logistics arm that 3 NATO member states currently contract under sealed agreements that will not be declassified. When I was 19 years old, my father, Edouard Montclair Dresner, a man who communicated primarily through silence and well-timed legal documents, sat me down in the library of our primary residence in Lisbon and told me something I have never forgotten. He said, "Isadora, every person who has ever wanted something from this family has told us they love us first. Learn to recognize the sequence. Love comes first, then the request." I didn't understand it entirely at 19. I thought it was being cynical in the way that very wealthy, very isolated men sometimes become cynical, as a defensive posture, a heart that had been disappointed too. My mother had left when I was 7. Several business partners had betrayed him. He had reason, but by the time I was 20, after a series of relations and social encounters that followed the pattern he had described with such relentless accuracy that it became almost darkly funny, I understood for the Lisbon, the fleet manifest, the account, the name on the Forbes Marit, every single one of them loved me with a precision. They complimented the right things, they said the right words, they showed interest in the right quantity, and then, eventually, always, the request arrived. An investment, a contract, an introduction, a marriage that would consolidate holding. The love was real enough in some shallow strata, but it was also, always, instrumental, a means. I was 31 when I decided I was done with. I arranged the details quietly. I created Elena Voss through channels that I will not describe in detail, but which were legal, thorough, and had been used before for reasons of personal security. I set up a modest life in the Westport district of a mid-sized coastal city, not the kind of place where my family was, not the kind of place with a private airstrip and a harbor concierge who recognized our name. I took the archiving position at the alderman, which required actual skill, and which I genuinely had, because I had spent 3 years in my mid-20s studying historical document preservation in Florence as a personal passion that my father had tolerated with bemusement. I kept a studio apartment. I cooked my own meal. I took the bus sometimes, not because it was character build, but because I genuinely needed to remember what a bus felt, what it sounded like, how the people on it moved and breathed and talked. I needed to be a person in the world, not a function of a dynasty. I told no one where I was, except for my head of personal security, a woman named Katana, who had been with my family for 16 years, and who communicated with me through an encrypted line on a device that looked exactly like a battered old Nokia and contained technology that would have interested several intelligent. Katana knew, no one else did. I gave myself 2 years 2 years to live as Elena Voss, to exist in a world where no one wanted anything except maybe a well-cogged medieval shipping or a cup of tea. I met Marcus Hale in the 4th month. He was standing outside the alderman, arguing with a delivery about a shipment of archive-quality storage boxes that had been sent to them. He was not winning the argument, but he was handling it with a kind of earnest, flustered energy that was, I admit, immediately appealing. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with brown eyes that were expressive in the way that actors study for years to achieve, and which some people simply have naturally. He was wearing a jacket that was slightly too large for him in the shoulders, and he had a coffee in one that was clearly getting cold. Gesticulate. I told him that the loading entrance was on the north side of the building, and that the driver had the right address. The manifest was just labeled incorrectly. He looked at me as though I had said something remarkable. "How do you know that?" "I work here," I said. "You've solved a problem I've been arguing about for 20 minutes in 10 seconds. The problem was a labeling," I said. "It wasn't complicated." He laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded and immediate. "I'm Marcus. I'm supposed to be picking up some historical shipping documents for a project a business plan. It involves port logistics. Then you should probably talk to someone inside," I said. "I'm one of the archivists." That was how it started. It sounds very simple because it was very simple. That is how the important things tend to begin. Marcus came back 3 more times that, officially for the document, which he did actually need. He was in the early stages of planning a maritime event logistics company, and the historical data on port traffic and cargo path was relevant research. But by the 3rd visit, the documents were a sec, and we both knew it. He asked if I wanted to have coffee. We had coffee. He told me about his business plan with a kind of open, almost naive enthusiasm that I found genuinely moving. Not because the plan was perfect, it had significant gaps, but because the excitement behind it was unperformed. He wasn't trying to impress. He was just telling me what he cared about. He had grown up with very little. His mother, Greta Hale, had worked 2 jobs for most of it in a small manufacturing town 3 hours inland. He had put himself through a regional business school on grants and part-time work. He had spent 6 years after graduation working in logistics for a mid-tier shipping firm, learning the industry from the ground level, and he had recently saved enough, combined with a small inheritance from an uncle, to strike out on his own. The business was called Hale Maritime Solutions. It had no clients yet, no office, and almost no capital. But he had the plan, and he had the drive. And he looked at me like, not an those 3 for a while, for me to entirely dangerous, genuine. I want to be precise, because it matters for everyone. I helped him as Elena Voss, which meant I helped him with what Elena Voss could plausibly provide. Contacts at the Alderman Foundation, with access to rare historical logistics data, evenings going over his business plan at my kitchen table, hours of conversation about infrastructure and maritime law, because those are things I know deeply and could present as archival. I helped him draft his initial pitch document, restructure his cost projection, identify gaps in his regulatory compliance planning. But I also, and this is where the line between Elena Voss and Isadora Montclair Dresner becomes deliberately, carefully blurred, I directed an anonymous early-stage investment that appeared in his accounts as a grant from a Maritime Heritage Foundation that does exist and that I control through 3 intermediaries. A warm introduction to a port authority contact in the city that came through a colleague of mine at the Alderman and was in fact directed to Tana at my instruction. A legal resource that materialized at a critical moment when his provisional operating was being challenged, presented as a pro bono referral through a non-profit that I fund. I rationalized this to myself in a way that I am not entirely proud of in retrospect. I told myself it was help, not interference, that I was supporting something genuinely good in a person who deserved it, that I wasn't shaping his success so much as removing obstacles that his situation had placed in front of him unfairly. What I did not tell myself, because it was too uncomfortable to examine, was that I was also making myself necessary, that by being the quiet, invisible infrastructure beneath his growing company, I was ensuring that the Elena Voss he's falling in love with was not entirely with, even if that power was. even if he didn't know. The relationship deepened his first year of business. We moved in together after 8 months, into a slightly larger, still in Westport, still modest, nothing that would signal anything. He was working 18-hour days, and I was beside him for most of them. I made dinners he ate standing at the counter. I listened to client call debriefs at mid. I became, in a way that felt entirely natural and also deeply chosen, the foundation of his daily life. He proposed on a Tuesday, not a special Tuesday, not at a restaurant, or with a photographer hidden around the corner. He proposed at the kitchen table, over a spreadsheet that had been giving him trouble, with a ring he had obviously chosen carefully, on a budget that was real for Marcus, even if it was a rounding error for Isadora Dresner. It was a single pearl, set in white gold, small and perfectly round, and I thought it was the most beautiful thing I had ever. I said yes, and I meant it. That was 8 months before the night of the Dorado. In those 8 months, the company scaled fast. Faster than Marcus could entirely account for, because some of the scaling was again quietly facilitated by Caetana following my direction. Key contracts that materialized through back-channel connection he thought were cold call results. A press mention, 2 Port Authority certifications that moved through bureaucratic channels with unusual. Hale Maritime Solutions became, by the end of that period, a legitimately operating company with 7 clients, a growing reputation in regional port logistics, and a significant event. The Dorado Maritime Hall had agreed to host the company's official launch party and industry showcase, which was also to serve as our engagement. It was going to be the night. His night. I was happy. I was proud of. Even knowing what I knew about how much had been built on I had quietly. And then, 3 weeks before the event, Marcus's mother, Greta Hale, was not the woman described to. Or rather, she was, technically, but she was a version of that woman that had been transformed by her son's rapidly success into something harder, specific. She had the bearing of a woman who had suffered real difficulty and had decided that the correct response to that difficulty was a permanent, granitic suspicion of anyone who might benefit from her family's new position. She arrived in Westport wearing a coat I recognized as a recent in Burberry, bought, I suspected, specifically for this visit, to establish a visual claim on the new elevation, and she looked at me from the moment of introduction with an assessment in remotely. Elena? Shaking my hand in a way that precisely. Marcus. The pause after the. You work with old documents? I'm an archivist. Yes, I said. At the Alderman Foundation. How practical, she said, in a tone that meant the opposite. Marcus laughed, that easy laugh, and put his arm around me and said his mother was just old-fashioned, and the moment. But it set the register for everything. Greta spent 4 days, and in those 4, she managed to convey, without ever saying anything that could be directly quoted and contested, that she believed I was not sufficient for her son's new life. She did it through very specific, very refined tools. She compared the apartment to what Marcus soon afforded, with a wistfulness that framed our current home as my inadequate. She talked about Marcus's trajectory in a way that made a modest archivist sound like a structural impediment. She mentioned, twice, a woman named Daniela who had gone to the same regional business school as Marcus and who was now, apparently, doing very well for herself in commercial real estate. The second time she mentioned Daniela, I watched Marcus. He didn't contradict his mother. He changed the subject, but there was a beat, half a second, a small settling his posture, that told me Greta had been saying these things before, in private, and that Marcus had been absorbing them at some level without deciding what. I noticed the beat. I filed it. 2 weeks before the Dorado event, a woman named Valentina Holt entered. She arrived in the context of a client meeting, a potential new contract with a hospitality and logistics group that Valentina's family controlled a significant stake in. She was, by any conventional metric, extraordinary. Dark hair, Mediterranean feet, a manner of entering a room that suggested she had never once doubted whether she wore a navy suit that I could have told you the provenance of without checking a label. The cut was unmistakably a Parisian, something in the €30,000 range, which is not a number that registers as anything other than a Tuesday to someone, but which in the context of a mid-sized port city and a fledgling maritime logistics company was the equivalent of a deck. She was interested. She was also, within 20 minutes of meeting Marcus Hale, interested in Marcus, and she did not try to obscure this interest in any meaning. I was there for the meet. I was there because because Elena Voss was Marcus and his sounding board and his quiet constant. But Valentina Holt looked at me once, assessed me with the particular efficiency of a woman who has been trained since childhood to catalogue other women's social weight, and then looked away. Not rudely, just finally. The way you look away from something that has been determined not to require further. Marcus noticed Valentina. Of course he. But for the first week after that meeting, he was still entirely himself, still the man at the kitchen table over the spreadsheet, still earnest and present and mine. The contract discussions continued. Valentina sent emails that were cordial and slightly more personal than strictly necessary. Marcus forwarded them to me and asked what I thought. I thought several things that I did not say. The week before the Dorado, Marcus changed. It was not dramatic. It was not one moment. It was, like most important deterioration, a series of small pivots, each one individually explainable, collectively revelatory. He started leaving his phone face down on the counter at times when he had never done that before. He came home from a lunch meeting 40 minutes late and offered the explanation unprompted, which was something he had never needed to do before because he had never given me reason to require it. He mentioned Valentina's name in conversation with a studiedly casual frequency that paradoxically made it more, not less, noticeable. And then, 5 days before the Dorado event, he said something that I have turned over in my mind many times, looking for an alternative interpretation, and have never found. He said, over dinner, looking at his glass rather than at me, Val's family has contacts across 6 European, the kind of contacts that take people decades to build. She's been talking about the possibility of a regional expansion. That sounds like a business opportunity, I said. It is, he said. It's also, she mentioned that her family sometimes formalizes through more direct. I looked at him. He was, Marcus, what exactly are you telling me? He looked up then, and his expression had something in it that I can only describe as rehearsed apology. The look of a man who has been sitting with a decision long enough that he has practiced the face when he does. I'm not telling you, I'm just saying the more complicated. I said no. You understand what's at stake with this launch. I understand it very well, I said. That was entirely true. He seemed to take my calmness agreement, or acceptance, or perhaps just relief that I wasn't going to be difficult. He refilled his glass and talked about the event for the rest of the evening, as though the previous 60 seconds hadn't. I sat there, quiet and present, and apparently, and I began, for the first time since I had created Elena, to think seriously about what it would mean to stop being. In the 4 days between that conversation and the Dorado event, things accelerated in ways that removed any remaining ambiguity. Greta arrived again, this time with Marcus's older sister, Petra, who shared her mother's talent for soft cruelty and had additionally cultivated of dressing that telegraphed disdain who has recently acquired and Petra had heard of. She brought her up within 2 hours of arriving, in a way that could technically be casual, but was anything but. She's incredibly well connected, Petra said at dinner, reaching past me for the bread without acknowledging the reach. The Holt family controls export concession Adriatic. I was reading about. Very recently, Petra looked at with a crystalline flash of dislike. Marcus deserves to have the right people, especially now. He does, I agree. She seemed slightly unsettled by my agreement. She had prepared for a different response. The morning of the Dorado event, Marcus sat with me at the kitchen table, the same table where he had proposed, the same table where we had worked through hundreds of late evenings, and he said, with the careful diction of someone reading from an internal script, tonight is going to be a significant night. There are going to be important people who could change everything for Hail Mary. I need tonight to go perfect. I want tonight to go perfect, I said. I've always wanted. He nodded, and then said the thing I will never. I just need you to understand that I might need to focus my attention on certain relationships, business, important, and I need you to not make that complicated. I looked at him for a long moment, at the brown eyes that had once been so unguarded, at the slightly too large jacket that he didn't wear anymore, because Valentina had apparently mentioned, at the hands that had been so animated over spreadsheets and cold coffee, now still and arranged with a deliberateness that didn't belong to the man I'd agreed to. I understand, I said. He seemed He kissed my cheek, not my mouth, my cheek, and went to get. I sat at the table for a few minutes after he left the room. Then I picked up the Nokia that looked battered and wasn't, and I sent 2 words to Katana. Prepare everything. I want to tell you what the Dorado Maritime Hall looks like outside before I tell you what, because the building sits directly on the harbor, and the architect, there have been several over its 100-year history, have maintained a particular quality in the stone facade that makes it look, at night, as though it is lit from within by something older and more permanent than electricity. The windows are tall and arched, and the light through them is always amber, always warm, and from the water, it looks like a place where important decisions have been made for a very long, it is that kind of building. Marcus had chosen it, and it was a good choice, and I had made sure the logistics of securing it had moved smoothly through channels he didn't trace. The guest list was 312 people. The catering was handled by a firm that I knew from prior experience, delivered without incident at events of the audiovisual setup, the branded screens showing the Hail Maritime solution, the lighting design, the stage configuration for Marcus's address, had been vetted by Katana's team under a consulting alias 2 weeks prior, not because I had planned what, but because I had learned, over 30, to always know the. I arrived with Marcus. We arrived together, his hand at the small of my back, his name on every surface, my name on no surface, which was how we had both agreed it should be. His night, his company, his moment. I was wearing a dress I had chosen carefully, deep midnight blue, simple, no jewelry, except the pearl, Elena Voss's. I had packed a change of clothes in, not for vanity, for precision. The first hour was, by any external measure, a success. The hall filled with exactly the kind of people Marcus needed. Port authority official, regional logistics executives, a deputy trade minister who had apparently owed a favor to someone whose name I recognized without showing it. Valentina Holt arrived at 40 minutes past the in a gown of champagne silk, with two people who were clearly there to constitute an entourage, and the room shifted slightly her direction, in the way rooms do when someone enters who has been anticipated. Marcus shifted too. I watched it happen. I was standing 6 feet away, talking to a Port Authority official about Mediterranean container route, something Elena Voss would have had to fake knowledge of, and which I discussed with a fluency that the official found unexpectedly impressive. And I watched Marcus's body language change from the moment Valentina. It was like watching a compass respond to a stronger magnetic. Petra was in a gown that had clearly been purchased for the specific purpose of looking more appropriate than mine. They had positioned themselves near the VIP area, a section of the hall that had been designated and roped off near the main stage, reserved for the most significant guests, and they watched Valentina move toward Marcus with expressions of barely restraint. I continued my conversation with official. He was telling me about routing challenges Adriatic. I found it genuinely, which Elena Voss would, and which Isadora Montclair Dresner knew intimate. I asked him 3 questions that made him look at me slightly different, with that particular expression of recalibration that happens when someone who was expecting a surface-level exchange encounters depth they hadn't prepared. And then, Marcus appeared. He was smiling. The smile, it had the warmth of a person who has decided what they are about to do and has organized their face to make it seem real. He thanked the port official, shook his hand, and then turned to me with the smiles. "Can I have a word?" he said. We stepped slightly aside, not far, not privately, just enough. And then he said, in a low voice, but not, several people near us. I could tell because of the small, involuntary stiffening, the particular quality of stillness that descends on bystanders who have just witnessed something they know they shouldn't have, but cannot stop watching. "I think it's better for tonight, if you enjoy the event from the general area, Marcus. The VIP section is for key business contacts and investors. You'd be more comfortable with the general guests. You understand?" I looked at him. "There's a guard who can show you." "I know where it is," I said. He nodded. "Great. I knew you'd understand." He patted my arm once, the way you pat an acquaintance, and turned back toward the VIP section, toward the champagne silk and the entourage and the harbor light arched window. The security guard materialized, young, professional, apologetic, in a way that told me he had not been given the full picture he was being asked. He gestured to the general area. The velvet rope was very red. The general area was very far from. The room was not quite, but it was, and I smiled. That cold smile, the one that my father had once. The smile. I pressed my thumb against the flat surface no larger than. I felt the single vibration that confirmed. Outside, the harbor lights began to. The security guard was still holding his arm out. He had a kind of professional. He was doing a job, and the job was uncomfortable, and he was managing it with more grace than the man. I looked at him and said "You don't need, but thank you." He blinked. Something in my voice had shifted register in a way that people before they understand. He lowered his arm slightly, not entirely, but enough. I turned and, not toward the velvet rope, not toward the general area, not toward the door, toward the floor-to-ceiling windows at the east end of the hall that looked directly out over the harbor. I wanted to see it. I had earned the right to see it. The water was dark and wide and very still. And then, one by one, like a constellation assembling itself from nothing, lights began to appear on its surface. Not the ordinary lights of the harbor, not the amber dockside lantern, or the small green and red running lights of the leisure boat that dotted the water. These were different, broader, more deliberate. White lights, positioned at intervals that were too precise, too geometric to be accidental. 7 of them were visible from where I stood. I knew from Caetana's last transmission that there were 17 total, arranged in an arc that covered the harbor mouth and every navigable exit from the Dorado property waterside. The 3 road exits were already handled. I couldn't see them from this window, but I didn't need. I knew the approach time. I stood at the window for exactly 45 seconds, watching the lights settle into position, and then I turned back to the room. The party was. The music, a quartet positioned near the main bar, playing something tasteful and European, had not faltered. The waitstaff moved with practiced serenity between clusters of guests. The champagne was very good. I had ensured that specifically. 312 people were eating, drinking, networking, performing the particular theater of industry events where everyone is simultaneously themselves and a curated. In the VIP section, Marcus was leaning toward Valentina Holt with the focused attention of a man who has decided to make a very large bet and is concentrating on convincing him it's a sure thing. Valentina was laughing at something he had said, her head tilted back, her champagne glass held at an elegant angle that managed to be both relaxed and calculated. Greta Hale stood nearby, watching her son with an expression of profound maternal vindication. Petra was talking to someone in Valentina's entourage, already auditioning for a role in. I watched all of this with the same quality of attention I bring to a logistics manifest, cataloging, prioritizing, noting what is relevant and what is noise. Then, I took out my phone, not the Nokia, my actual phone, a device that no one in this room had ever seen me carry, because Elena Voss did not own it. It was matte black, edge to edge, and the screen when it lit was showing 17 confirmed vessel positions and 43 vehicle status indicators, all green. I made a call. Kitana answered on the first ring, as she always. The perimeter? I said. Complete, she said. Road access points Alpha, Beta and Gamma are blocked as of 90 seconds ago. Harbor mouth is covered. The legal team is at the secondary entrance and ready to proceed on your signal. And the documentation package? Complete and certified. Notarized copies in 3 sets. The digital filings went through at 1947. Everything is registered. Good, I said. Give me 4 minutes. Understood. I ended the call and turned the phone face up in my hand so the screen was visible, not ostentatious, just resting there, a small rectangle of factual light, as I walked back through the main hall toward the VIP section. The security guard saw me coming. He had clearly been given instruction. He moved to intercept, placing himself with the apologetic firmness of someone doing a job they wish were different. Ma'am, I'm sorry. This area is reserved, I said. Yes, I know. Step aside. He didn't step aside. He was doing his job. I respected, so I gave him something he could use. My name, I said, in a voice calibrated precisely for him and for the 6 people immediately surrounding us, who were now paying very close attention, is Isadora Valea Montclair Dresner. I am the sole executive shareholder of the Montclair Dresner Maritime Group, which is the registered primary investor and capital underwriter of Hale Maritime Incorporated. I hold 100% of the company's investment note, which carry conversion rates that were triggered by a filing. I glanced at my phone. 19 minutes ago. This means that as of 19 minutes ago, I am, in the most literal legal sense, the owner of the. Now, would you like to step aside, or would you like to call your supervisor and hear it from someone with a title? The guard stared at. The 6 people in the immediate vicinity were no longer pretending not to listen. Step aside, I said. Please. He stepped aside. I walked through the velvet rope. The rope did not move. I unclipped it myself. With one hand, the small metal latch releasing with a sound that was quiet, but somehow, in the way these seemed to carry further, I replaced it with the same deliberate. Marcus saw me from his face did something. It went through 3 expressions in approximately. First, surprise, the basic neurological response to expected, then irritation, the face of a man whose careful arrangement disrupted, and then, as I continued, at an unhurried something that was not quite adjacent in the way a shadow. It was the expression of a man who has just noticed, for the first time, that he does not know something. Elena, he started. Isadora, I said. My name is Isadora. It has always been Isadora. Elena Voss is an identity I created and maintain for personal reasons that I will explain to you in documentation that my legal team provide within the. I stopped, but that's actually secondary, so let's address the idiot situation. Valentina Holt had taken a half step back. She was looking at me with an expression that had shifted from dismissal to something more carefully attentive. The expression of a woman who has grown up around serious money and is recalibrating whether she is looking at. Greta Hale had appeared at Marcus's shoulder. What is this? She said. What is happening? Mrs. Hale, I said, without looking away from. You're welcome to stay for the minutes. I think it will be useful for you to hear this directly. Marcus, Greta's, sharp and low. Tell this woman. Mrs. Hale. This time I did look, and the look was to stop this. Please. The music had not stopped. The catering was still moving. But there was a widening circle of stillness, the social physics of a room responding to a concentration of something it cannot yet name, but can feel. Marcus, Hale Maritime Solutions was capital through a series of investments that arrived via the Maritime Heritage Foundation, through 2 intermediary holding structures, and through direct advisory services provided under the identity I maintained during our relationship. Those investments, totaled and documented, constitute 100% of the company's outside capital. The investment notes I hold include a standard conversion clause, conversion to full equity upon triggering events, one of which is material misrepresentation of the investor relation. That clause was triggered when you listed the company's investor as anonymous on the Dorado Events Industry Registration document, which is a direct breach of the note agreement. The conversion filing was completed at 1947. As of that filing, I hold 100% of the equity In Hail Maritime, Marcus opened his mouth. He closed it. That means, that the company you have been building, the company this event was designed to launch, belongs entirely. The name, the contracts, the certification, the client relationships, the port authority registration, the 7 active accounts, the proprietary logistics software that your development team built using capital I provided, all of it, mine. The music stopped. I don't know if the quartet had simply reached the end of their piece, or if some atmospheric shift in the room had communicated itself to them through some channel musicians are attuned to, and the rest of us aren't. But the silence that followed was total and immediate, and the quality of it was different from any. It was the silence of 312 holding their breath at the same moment, without coordinating. Petra said, from somewhere to, "This is in." Marcus clearly "She's not," said a voice. Everyone, standing at the entrance to the Dorado Maritime Hall, all of them in dark suits, several of them carrying document cases, 2 of them wearing the kind of earpieces that only appear in very specific context, were 9 people. At the front of them was a woman in her early 50s, with close-cropped silver hair and the precise, contained posture of someone who has spent decades in rooms where things are. This Caetana. She was holding a sealed envelope package that was thick enough to contain, as I knew it did, certified copies of every document I had just described, plus 12 additional ones that were relevant. Behind Caetana and her legal team, visible through the open main doors in the amber and harbor line, was the access road that led to the Dorado. It was full of vehicles. The ones nearest the entrance were closest and most visible. 4 black SUVs, the specific shade of black that comes from armored coating rather than paint, a weight to their stillness that ordinary cars don't have. Behind them, stretching back along the road in a column that extended further than could reach, were more. The shape of them in the dark was unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at. A motorcade of a scale that simply does not appear at maritime logistics launch events in mid-sized coastal. Several guests near the windows on the western side of the had already seen them. I could tell by the quality of their stillness, the rigid, forward-leaning posture of people watching something they need more information. The lights on the water were now all 17, and in the time since I had last looked, the closest vessels had moved to positions that were close enough for their silhouettes to be visible against the night. Hulls that were not the hulls of commercial shipping, not the rounded, high-sided profiles of container vessel or tankers, but the lower, harder line of something built for a different. Someone near the west window. What are those ships? No one answered, because no one in that room had an answer that fit the framework. Caetana walked across the whole floor, her heels precise and unhurried, and stopped beside me. She handed me the envelope. All certified. The harbor authority has been noted. 3 vessels and the Coast Guard are on standby at our courtesy of the standing agreement. Thank you, I said. The vehicles outside are yours when you need. I know, I said. Give me a few more minutes. She nodded and stepped back, positioning herself with an economy of movement that placed her exactly where she would need to be to respond to anything without being in the way of any. I turned back to Marcus. He had aged in the last, not literally, not physically, but the particular quality of certainty he had carried for the last several, the quality that had allowed him to look at me over a dinner table and describe my replacement as a landscape complicated. What remained was a version of him that was younger and more frightened, and, in some way that I registered, the complicated, more like the man Isadora. It was the first time he had said my real name. He said it carefully, as though learning the weight of a word existed. I didn't. No, I said. You didn't. That was. If I had known, you would have acted differently. Exactly. That's the problem. Not what you knew. What you are when you don't know. I looked at him steadily. The man I met outside this building 2 years ago, arguing about a mislabeled delivery. He was the man at the kitchen table at midnight over spreadsheets and cold coffee. He was real. I loved that man, and I helped him because he deserved to be. A pause. But what you did tonight, what you decided to do, and how you decided to do, and who you did, that's also, and it tells me something that 2 years of loving you didn't show. He was shaking, not in denial, in the way people shake their heads when they can see a door closing and cannot find the mechanism to stop it. The company's accounts, I said, have been frozen as of 22 minutes ago, pending the equity transfer. The 7 active client contracts will receive notification tomorrow morning from the legal team identifying me as the new principal. You will receive a formal settlement offer within 72 hours. It will be fair. I'm not interested in punishing you beyond what is proportionate, and what is proportionate is that you receive nothing from a company you did not build with, but you are also not left destitute. You built skills and industry knowledge that are genuine and have those I cannot and would not. I held the envelope, and Caetana took it back from. What I'm taking, I said, is everything. Greta, whatever composure she had arrived with, had been completely dismantled. She was standing with her hands at her sides in tight, white-knuckled fists, and her voice when she spoke had the particular high pitch of a person who is genuinely, elementally, and expressing that as aggression because they have no other. You can't just, this is fraud. What you did, living as someone else, it's fraud. Marcus, call your lawyer right. She can't, Mrs. Hale, said one of the attorneys, who had arrived with katana. He was a tall man, with reading glasses pushed up on his head, and a manner so calm it was almost aggressive. The identity maintenance was conducted within all applicable legal framework. We can discuss the statute, time and location, but I'd encourage you to consult your own counsel before making further public statement. Character. Greta stared at. For what it's worth, he added, with a courtesy that was genuine and somehow made every. You can keep the sham. Petra said nothing. She had gone very still, in the way people go still when they have realized fully and that they have been performing a role in a drama whose actual scale they understand, and that the role they chose. Valentina Holt was watching expression that had traveled far from. The assessment in her eyes was now undisguised and thorough, and it had the quality of professional respect, the specific look of someone who has grown up with serious wealth and is recognizing correctly that they are in the presence so much more serious that the gap between them is effective. She met my eyes when I glanced at. She gave a very not apology, not conciliation, acknowledgement. The kind that people with real breeding offer when they have been definitively outclassed and know it. I respected that. I didn't show it. Marcus said, please, just the word, low and alone. I looked at him, the brown eyes, still expressive, the jaw that I had known the feeling of under my hand, the hands that had been so animated over those spreadsheets, all of it still there, all of it still recognizable, all of it, now, beside the point. Marcus, I said, 2 years ago, you looked at a woman you thought was an arc with a used Volvo and no money and no connect, and you loved me. I believed, I have always believed, and it mattered to me more than you know, because it was the first time in my adult life that anyone had loved me without knowing what. He was listening with his whole body, the way people listen when they know they are hearing something final. But love is not only what, I said. It's also what you do with what you feel when things get complicated, when someone else appears who seems more useful, when your mother tells you that the woman you propose to is not adequate for your new life, when you have to choose between what is true and what convenient. You made your choice to, very public, and I picked up my clutch, the small black satin, the one with the matchbox device still in, and I turned to. We're done here, I said. The car is at the north entrance, she said. First in the column. Good. I walked across the Dorado Maritime Hall for the last time. The floor was the same marble it had always been, with the faint grain of the stone visible on cream and grey, and the trace of something almost rose where the mineral deposits. The tall arched windows were on my right, and through them the harbour was illuminated with the lights of 17 vessels, all of them holding position with the stillness that only very disciplined people and very well-maintained machines can hold for extended periods. The quartet near the bar had their instruments lowered. The guests had arranged themselves in the unconscious geometry of crowds, watching something significant, a wide, loose arc, facing the direction of the action, maintaining enough distance to feel safe. Nobody said anything. From the moment I began walking, that was loud enough. There were whispers. There are all, but whispers are weather. They happen behind you and dissipate and leave. At the main entrance, I stopped, not for drama, for a practical reason. I needed to give Katana a final instruction about the vehicle rotation and which road access point to use for departure. This conversation took approximately 11 seconds, but in those 11 seconds, I was standing where the light from inside the hall met the air from, and I could feel the difference in temperature between them. The amber warmth of the event, but the clean night air of the harbour, and carrying with it the bitter salt in engine, which is one of the smells I have known, and which I with things that are permanent. I stepped. The vehicle was exactly where Katana had said. The lead SUV in the column, the one I would be riding in, had its rear door already open, held by one of the security a young man named Tomas, who I knew had joined the personal detail 18 months prior, and who I had never had to criticize. He was standing at attention in the way the detail always stood when they were in formation, and when I reached the car, he simply said, "Welcome back, Ms. Montero-Dresner. Not director, not my lady, not any of the other titles that technically apply, and which the older members of the staff sometimes use formally, just my name, my real name." "Thank you, Tomas," I said, and I got into the car. The door closed. The sound from outside became very distant very quickly. The particular acoustic insulation of an armored vehicle is something that has always seemed to me like one of the more honest metaphors for what wealth actually provides. Not comfort, exactly, not happiness, but a certain management of the noise of a buffer between you and the chaos that is always. I sat back against the leather seat and looked out the darkened window as the column began to move. I could see the entrance to the Dorado Maritime Hall receding. Through the tall arched window, I could still see the amber light and the shapes of the guests, The tiny geometry of the crowd still gathered around the space I had just vacated. I could not see Marcus from this angle, but I knew where he was standing. I knew what his face was probably. I knew what the next few hours would bring for the attorneys, the documentation, the cold reality of account statement that no longer responded to his access. I did not feel exact. I want to be honest about that, because the temptation in moments like this is to perform an emotion, triumph, vindication, the clean-up swing of justice delivered, and I have always found that performed emotions are a kind of interior dishonesty that eventually costs more than it pays. What I felt was something more complex and less a grief that was for the man in the too large jacket, a relief that was also real for the ending of a performance that had lasted 2 years, and beneath both of those, something steadier and quieter, the particular solidity that comes from knowing with precision who you. Elena Voss was dissolved. The rented apartment would be cleared by Kaitana's logistic by morning. The Volvo, the color of old pewter, had already been transferred back to the Alderman Foundation position, which I had genuinely loved and would genuinely miss, had been vacated through a formal resignation submitted that afternoon, with a donation to the Foundation's conservation fund that would sustain 3 archivists for a decade. Elena Voss had served her purpose. She had proven what she was designed to prove, that it was possible, even for someone like me, to be loved without condition. She had also proven something darker and more useful, that love without condition is not the same as love that holds on. The condition, it turned out, had not been money. The condition had been relevance. The moment Marcus had seen a different kind of relevance, the love had reoriented itself toward it with the ease of something that had never been as unconditional as it appeared. My father's voice in the library in Lisbon. Love comes first, then the request. He had been right. He had been right, and I had needed to learn it for myself, which is the only way anyone really learns anything. And the learning had cost 2 years of my life and a pearl ring that I had left on the kitchen table that morning before I dressed, because I had known even then how not the specific. I had hoped, as late as the morning, that I was wrong about, but the general the arc of it. I reached into the small black clutch and took out the matchbox device, the tracker, the signal unit, and held it in my palm for a moment. It was very light. It always surprised me how light it was, given what it could set in motion. I put it away. The column moved through the harbor district, 43 vehicles in formation, the sound of them in the night street, a low, organized rumble that would certainly prompt questions from who happened to be outdoors and would have no sensors available. On the water alongside us, visible through the gaps between the harbor building, the 17 vessels were beginning their withdrawal, repositioning back to their standard coordinates, the formation dissolving into ordinary maritime the lights returning to the path of a normal. I sent a message, full withdrawal, standard return protocol, and then, thank you, perfectly. Her reply came in under 10, always. There is something I want to say about what it actually, stripped of the performance, the theater, the SUVs and the harbor lights, and the legal documents, and the silence that falls over a room when something that was hidden becomes visible. Those things are all, and they are all, and in the right moment, they serve a function, but they are not themselves the thing. The thing, the actual substance that all of those external expressions gesture to, is the knowledge of who you are when the room is empty, when there is no one watching, when there is no event to attend, no identity to maintain, no performance to deliver, when it is just you in a car, moving through a night city, holding what you know about yourself in your hand, like something weightless and specific and I am Isadora Valea, Montclair Dresner. I am 33. I control the largest privately operated maritime fleet on Earth. I can block a harbor in 45 minutes and freeze a company's accounts in less. I spent 2 years living as an archivist in a studio apartment, and I was genuinely happy, which is something that no amount of money can guarantee, and which I do not take for granted. I am not angry. Anger is weather. It passes. I am not diminished. You cannot diminish something by failing to recognize. You can only reveal the limits of your own perception. What I am, on the other side of this, is clear. Clear about what I want, which is to be loved correctly, not without condition, because that was always a fiction, but with conditions that are honest and clear about what I will not accept, which is the particular cruelty of being made invisible by someone whose visibility I spent 2 years building. Clear about the distance between what people are when they think nothing is at stake and what they become when the stakes change. Marcus Hale will rebuild. He has genuine skills. I meant that. I was not performing generosity. I said it. He knows the logistics industry in a way that is real and earned, and the settlement offer my attorneys send him will be fair, as I said, because fair is I am interested, not punishment. Punishment is weather. It passes and leaves mud. What will not rebuild, what I will not rebuild, is Elena is gone. She did what she came to do. If I ever choose to live anonymously again, I will do it different. I will be more careful. I will trust the ark more slowly. I will also trust the, not because love is not worth, but because love that cannot survive knowledge is not love. It is love for the vacancy, the space, the absence of a and vacancy, I have learned, is not the same. The car slowed as we reached the point where the harbor district transitioned into the older part of the city, the wide stone streets, and the buildings with their iron balconies, and the smell, rising through the ventilation, of salt-water night air, and somewhere close the particular of something baking, bread or from one of the early morning bakeries that serve the people who begin their days before the rest of. I rolled the window down and just in at the smell. Outside, the city was quiet and enormous and entirely indifferent to everything that happened. This is one of the things I love most. They're in but scale. They are too old to. They open their bakeries and light their early lights and turn their faces toward whatever morning is coming. And they do this with a consistency that is, in its way, the most reliable kind of fidelity. I breathed the air. I closed the window. We drove. True power does not announce itself. It does not need to shout or perform or carry external signals of its own significance. It is simply what remains when everything false has been removed, when the identity you constructed has served its purpose, when the patience you practiced has reached its limit, when the moment arrives and you move through it with the knowledge of exactly what you are capable, and the stillness that comes from that knowledge is more absolute than anything noise. I have sat in rooms with presidents. I have signed documents that altered the logistics of international commerce. I have maintained a fiction in a studio apartment in a city where no one knew my name, and I have loved someone honestly that fiction, and I have lost that love in the only by watching the person demonstrate of their own free will and with plenty of runway who's different that they were not. I will be fine. I was always. That is, I suppose, the thing about knowing who. It makes the question of fine almost irrelevant, because fine is a minimum, and you have always been operating well above that threshold. What I will be is more than fine. What I will be is more precise and more willing to wait for something that is worth the wait. The column moved, 43 vehicle, silent and certain and going home. Behind us, in the harbor, the last lights of the fleet extinguished one by one, and the water returned to its ordinary darkness, and the Dorado Maritime Hall stood in its amber light with its 312 guests, and its frozen accounts, and its branded screens, still showing the logo of a company that now belonged entirely to a woman who had just left through the front door with nothing in her hands and everything already in. And somewhere in that room, a man was standing with a pearl ring on the table, though he would find it he would pick it up, and it would be very small, and he would understand in that moment the full dimension. There is nothing more to say. The story ends with the weight of that ring in his hand, and with me in a moving car, and with the harbor going dark behind, and with Katana sending confirmation that all vessels have reached standard repositioning, and all personnel have checked out. I read the message. I replied with a single, good. And I sat back, and the city moved past the darkened window, and I let myself be, for the first time in 2 years, entirely and only, and without apology, what I have. Now, if you've made it to this moment in the story, to this particular point where the harbor lights go out and the column drives away and the ring sits waiting on a kitchen table for a morning that will change everything for one person and nothing at all, then you already know what you think about. You know whether you know whether the 2 years meant something, whether the cold smile at the end was justice or just the cleanest possible form of grief translated in. What did you think of this masterful revenge? Did he get what he deserved? If you loved watching arrogance meet its precise and absolute limit, if you felt something when those harbor lights came on and those vehicles formed their column and the velvet rope became irrelevant, smash that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of karma, power, and the particular satisfaction of watching the truth exactly on schedule.